And in my article, I actually argued that the works of Adam Smith and Karl Marx are very relevant for this task, which might look like or sound like a bit of a kind of controversial argument, because there is a kind of widespread assumption that Marx and Marxism in particular are deeply Eurocentric. And if we look at the works of Said, Spivak, Chakrabarty, but also at the late Gunther Frank or Giovanni Arrighi, we find a similar criticism of Marx as a Eurocentric thinker. And all these scholars actually share the assumption that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx looked at capitalism as a kind of self-enclosed economic system separated from its colonial reality. And in this kind of framework, capitalist development is conceptualized in isolation from external expansion in the form of colonialism and imperialism. And I believe that this understanding of development is actually closely linked to an understanding of history that sees history as a linear process in which each people, conceptualized in isolation from each other, has to go through the same stages in order to reach industrialization, development, or even socialism. And in this kind of model, in my view, the agency of non-European peoples is structurally downplayed or silenced, up to the point of even justifying colonialism or the progressiveness of imperialism. So this is a kind of harsh criticism of the kind of assumptions of Marx in particular. But I think that if we look at the kind of roots of both sociology and political economy in the works of the Scottish Enlightenment itself, we don't find a strong evidence supporting this kind of interpretation. And in the article, I look at particularly Adam Smith's conceptualization of capitalism in the Wealth of Nations. And I think it's important to bear in mind that Smith actually developed the labor theory of value at the dawn of the Atlantic revolutions. And when he developed this theory, he actually looked at the kind of process of capitalist accumulation as a global process. And I think that the labor theory of value actually allowed him to conceptualize capitalist accumulation as a global process. And indeed, if we look specifically at the historical parts of the Wealth of Nations, we see that Adam Smith kind of paid a lot of attention to processes of colonization and protectionism in the development of manufacturer production in Britain. And he also identified the interactions between and the specificities of geographically coexisting societies. And it's not, I think, an accident, in my view, that Adam Smith is one of the first theorists who actually developed a political economy analysis of Asian societies in China and in India. But I also think that these kind of insights that we can find in Adam Smith's work actually clashed with his support for colonialism and capitalism, and the kind of autocentric and kind of understanding of capitalist development that derives from this kind of justification of the system actually underpins his stagist vision of history. A kind of, he's one of the main theorizers of the stagist understanding of history. I think that this is a kind of view of history that contradicts other insights in his own work. And I think that this understanding actually is increasingly disconnected from the violence of colonialism and also the struggles of the colonized. And if we look at the work of Karl Marx, in particular I worked on his notebooks that are published for the first time in the new historical critical edition of the completed works of Marx and Engels. So Marx published these notebooks since the early 40s, and if we look at his economic notebooks since 1843-44, we actually see that from the very beginning of his economic studies, Marx was well aware of the contradictions of Smith's system, and he also kind of tried to analyze the close connection between capitalism and colonialism, and at the same time also studied the main works of world history of his time. And in continuity with the works of the mercantilists, actually Marx looked at the European economies as colonial economies that included both formal and informal colonies, and also situated the Industrial Revolution in Britain within a global context. I don't think it's an exaggeration to argue that his studies and kind of also articles on the Atlantic slave trade and its importance for the development of industrialization in Britain actually anticipate some contemporary studies of global and connected history. And if we look at his writings already before the manifesto, we see that Marx didn't just consider the importance of the triangular trade and of the Chinese and Indian markets to the development of capitalism in Europe, but also paid great attention to the consequences of industrialization and deindustrialization in very, very vast areas of the globe, from Latin America to Africa to the Middle East to Asia, looking also at the kind of more probably unknown areas, countries in Central Asia at the time. What I argue in my article is that, in my view, it's at the beginning of the 50s, and in particular in the wake of the Taiping Revolution, that Marx really changes his mind about the connection between anti-colonial struggles and worker struggles in Europe. So I argue that this is a real turning point in his elaboration. And in particular, in his articles on China in 1950, for the first time, he supports the struggles of the colonized against British colonialism. And what he called the formidable revolution of the Taiping actually gathered millions of peasants who extended their control over central China, instituted a system of communitarian life, and partitioned the land. And for Marx, I think this was a very important process because it manifested the agency of non-European people, and it also pushed Marx to ground his critique of capitalism not just in the struggles of European workers, as it was the case in the manifesto, in my view, but also in the struggles of colonized peoples. And so through these studies, especially studies on China, actually Marx came to the conclusion that there wasn't anything inevitable about the expansion of colonialism in Asia. He actually argued that the Asiatic mode of production and Asian societies could actually exercise a strong resistance against the expansion of capitalism. And he, I think, also argued that these forms of peasants' revolt could actually spark a social revolution in Europe itself. And so in this article in 1853, he actually argues that the next uprising of the people of Europe may depend more probably on what is now passing in the Celestial Empire than on other political cause that now exists. So I think that looking at this interconnection of struggles internationally allowed him to understand and look at non-European people not just as agents of their own history, but also as kind of agents of world politics. And I think this is a very important turning point and actually marking the first step in a process of increasing attention on Marx's part towards the forms of resistance and knowledge elaborated in the South.